our first question for you today is, can you describe to us what social science environmental health research means to you?
That's an interesting question, because when I got that question, I thought, what is social science environmental health research? Because I've never heard it called exactly that. So I Googled it, of course, and realized, oh, that is what I do. So it's not a completely surprising question. To me, social science environmental health research is research into environmental health that pays close attention to the social context of health, or the social determinants of health. So race, class, gender, ethnicity, power, all the social processes that shape how people exist in the world and how their health is influenced. But another really critical component of it for me is it also has to be, for me, environmental or social research that pays attention to the ecological context of health. And I think it's really important that both social processes and broader ecological processes get considered together. And that seems to me what's so innovative and important about this field.
Mm-hmm. And maybe can you tell us just a little bit about your thinking about that ecological component?
Sure. You know, I feel very strongly that human health exists because we're immersed in much larger ecosystems. That our health is always about relationships. It's not just about, do we have a cold right now or do we have cancer, important as those are. It's about all the different ecological and social interrelationships that make up who we are and how we fit into much broader environments. So for example, the immune system isn't just about T cells or immune responses. It's also about much larger and much finer ecological processes that interconnect with who we are as individuals, who we are as communities, and who we are as parts of larger ecosystems. So I don't think we can really be healthy if our water is unhealthy or if our soils are unhealthy.
Excellent. Can you please describe for us your academic training, both in terms of social science and environmental health science, and in your case, also humanities?
Sure. I'm an environmental historian technically right now. So I look at how environmental change and social change have affected each other over time. So I'm really interested in very applied questions. I want to know, how did we get where we are today? Because I think that to fix our health, we need to know how we got to the conditions we're in today. So I have a very historical perspective, but I never actually trained as a historian. As an undergraduate, I was pre-med. I worked in an immunology lab at Dartmouth Medical School all the way through my undergraduate, but I was half literature just for fun, just because you could do that. And then I worked in a hospital and realized that, one, I didn't want to be inside all the time because I was spending all the time I could outside. And two, for whatever complicated reasons, I had never heard of disease ecology. I'd never heard of broader environmental health questions. But I realized I didn't want to move into a career where I was treating individuals in hospitals or in isolated settings. So I went to England. I did an MPhil actually in literature and humanities, completely unrelated, still thinking I'd go to med school, but not really knowing what I was doing, except knowing I wasn't ready to do that. And then while I was there, I got very interested in ecology and especially disease ecology. So I went on for a PhD in ecology and evolution at University of Washington, and my fields were endocrinology, ecology, and evolution. And I worked in Zimbabwe along the Zambezi River for 2 field seasons. And I was working on a project on birds, but this was in the late 80s, and Zimbabwe was going through enormous social changes. And there was a lot of just incredibly high cerebral malaria rates, a lot of malnutrition, enormous immigrations into a parks and protected area, a lot of violence. I had guards with me, and they were ordered to shoot any other African on site because the assumption was an African in this nation, in this game reserve, would be a poacher. And so without even knowing about it, I realized that geography and social relations had a lot to do with environmental change, and health was obviously a big issue. So I went back to Washington, couldn't get my permits to finish my third year, or my third year of ecology research, because President Mugabe was just really making it difficult. So at that point I decided I shifted and I did my PhD in forest health, and I was looking at how fire adapted ecosystems changed because of social and political decisions. So I was looking at how suppressing fire led to enormous environmental health issues for forests. And in doing that, thinking I was going to do an ecology project, I ended up getting really interested in the history of restoration and the history of management and why people did what they did. So I did my postdoc at Washington, actually in albatross ecology, and we were looking at some albatrosses that had been caught as bycatch in the squid drift net fishery that was going on then, mostly Korean boats. And the National Marine Fisheries Service wanted to know if these squid drift nets were catching enough albatrosses to affect the population. So we, some people got to go to the Leeward Hawaiian Islands where they were nesting. I got to take the dead, rotten birds and dissect them in the lab, which was fun in some ways. And we found indeed that that the bycatch was really affecting the black-footed albatross population, because mostly breeding females were getting caught. It wasn't affecting the laissons. It was certainly killing a lot of laissons albatrosses, but much younger birds. And so this was a small part of a much bigger project. It did end up being part of shutting down the squid driftnet fishery. So I realized, oh look, science can affect policy. But what we also realized was 80% of these birds had plastics in their guts. And the birds with more plastic, it looked like they had a lot more parasites in their esophagus. And so I was working with a parasitologist, Nigella Hilgarth, and we were looking at the evolutionary ecology of these parasites and how they intersected with molts and incomplete breeding seasons and missed breeding opportunities. And at the time, we were just like, wow, look at all that plastic in their guts. Because the styrofoam in particular breaks down and looks just like squid eggs. So they were, selecting these, thinking they were eggs, and then they were feeding them to their chicks as well. So in the process of doing that, actually the next step was I got a job at Madison to teach in the Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies Institute. And so I was hired as their environmental humanist because I'd done some history and a lot of ecology. And so I spent the next 18 years at Madison and really trying to combine geography, history, and ecology. And so my next book was on the boundaries between water and land and how irrigation had really transformed high desert wetlands in the American West. And as part of that, I was asked to serve on the National Research Council Committee on Klamath Basin endangered fish. And we realized that there were so many enormous health issues that affected the wetlands, the large lake, the shallow lake systems, the fish, and the people who were eating those fish. So the process of doing that got me very interested in endocrine disrupting chemicals. So that became an article, which then became my most recent book. And in the process of writing that book, I got really interested in fish as vectors that connect the health of aquatic ecosystems and the health of people who eat those fish. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm working mostly on mining and pulp industry and how they affect fish and people in the Lake Superior watershed.
Wow. And currently you are in Sweden.
Yes, I'm the King's Professor of Environmental Science here for 9 months, which is just a really amazing opportunity. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is I work with a number of different Anishinaabe groups along Lake Superior, and so our Ojibwe tribes. And in Sweden, I'm able to work with some Sami groups and look at how they're responding to mining and how they're really concerned that open pit iron mining, which is moving forward here as well as it might be moving forward in Wisconsin because of the vote yesterday. I'm working with them on how they're really concerned that will affect their reindeer herding and their cultural health, and also affect the health of the watershed, and through that the fish and themselves. So there's some very, very similar questions with indigenous land tenure rights, access to clean water, what that means for the cultural health as well as the bodily health of a nation. But there are also obviously real big differences in Sweden versus Canada versus US. So I'm learning a lot about how important politics and the past are in the kinds of environmental health challenges people face today.
If I'm hearing you right, it's because human health is so dependent upon ecological health that you have to tie those two things together. Am I reading that correctly?
That's certainly what I feel. I mean, obviously there's a huge need for people who work on these isolated parts of the picture. But I think to really understand some of the questions that I'm really concerned about now, which are synthetic chemical and how we've allowed so many of these chemicals to be released into the environment, and how we've had so much uncertainty since the 1930s and even earlier over what the potential effects might be. I think understanding those questions obviously requires a lot of endocrinology, a lot of molecular biology, but those fields aren't enough on their own. And also purely social sciences, I think, aren't quite enough on their own. I think it's really important to have at least some people trying to do interdisciplinary research.
And can you tell me, where do you maybe hope or envision this field of interdisciplinary social science, environmental health research will go in the future?
You know, I don't know how to answer that question. I can always answer questions that students ask me about what sorts of questions should I be working on, but where the entire field, I'm never sure. What the entire field needs is, you know, more NIH and NSF funding. I think it's also really important to do more work that looks at transnational questions, because I think a lot of the determinants of our environmental policies, obviously, especially with health, happen within the nation state. I mean, just look at the discussions over healthcare provision. It's very different when you cross borders. But the kinds of environmental challenges we're facing now are transnational in lots of ways. The persistent organic pollutants that many of us work on cross national borders really quickly, even though the policies are limited, often limited, not always, to national borders. The kinds of issues regarding, say, gender and access to health care, the kinds of issues regarding race or class in healthcare are sometimes bounded by national boundaries, but often they really cross national boundaries. So, for example, right now, working on mining, I'm looking at artisanal mining, you know, very small scale informal mining, and how women and men are often affected by toxics quite differently, in part because they have very different physiologies with regard to metabolizing many of these chemicals, in part because they have different reproductive outcomes, especially for women's pregnant. So men's being exposed to these chemicals certainly can affect future generations, but also simply because women are often so invisible in mining. When people say a miner, they think a man, so they ignore the fact that about 30% of the 13 to 20 million people involved in small-scale informal mining today are women. So that's, you know, millions of people who are really overlooked by international policy, not just by U.S. policy, where there's not a lot of really small-scale mining going on. So, you know, I think there should be more people working on gender, more people working on mining, but obviously climate change is huge. But I think the big question it's a little hard to find funding and a little hard to find people in the right discipline is to think about what happens across state boundaries.
Excellent, thank you. How has this interdisciplinary approach strengthened your work? What are the benefits of this interdisciplinary social science environmental health research, and what are the greatest challenges?
Well, the greatest challenges, of course, are trying to just figure out what's going on. You know, the biggest challenge is ending up with a very superficial analysis because you don't really know the models or the assumptions or the mathematics or the literature, you know, what's already been done in other fields. And that's as true for molecular biologists trying to learn a little sociology as it is for historians trying to learn a little molecular biology. Things change so quickly and you just can't keep up with the literature. So that leads to one of the biggest opportunities, which is you can't do it all yourself, so you need to be working with other people. And so I think a huge opportunity is forming teams asking a question where interdisciplinary approaches lead to something better than what you could do on your own. So for example, I think there are lots of questions where if you try and answer the question from just within one discipline, you'll sometimes come up with the wrong answer because you're ignoring the insights from other disciplines. So one quick question, one of my grad students working on forest health was trying to figure out why white pine was vanishing from much of northern Wisconsin. And most ecologists had assumed it was because of the white pine blister rust. Currants were brought over as part of the nursery trade almost a century ago. They brought a fungus, and that spread. And so foresters were kind of working on the assumption you couldn't get white pine back. But what Michelle did was, she's part a landscape ecologist, but part an environmental historian. And she looked at a set of sources, archival records from the tribes, forestry plans in the 20s and 30s, and realized that there actually was a huge amount of white pine regeneration, in part because the young Indian men were employed as laborers to pull out the currants. And then when that got too expensive, when the war started, they were sent off to war. And then at the same time, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs really decided aspen was what we all needed for a healthy forest, because it was healthy for the pulp industry, for paper. I mean, it was healthy, but in a different way than purely ecological health. So really, it was a set of political and social decisions that led to dramatic changes in forest health. And so she couldn't have figured that out just as a social scientist. But the ecologists also couldn't figure out just on their own. They really needed to have a team of people asking the same question, but looking at it from different angles. And I think that's true for lots of questions in broader questions of environmental health as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Can you tell us, how did you learn all these different principles and methods of environmental health as a science?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it I learned as a graduate student when endocrinology was one of my fields. I was working in John Wingfield's group. Seaver Rower, an ecologist, was one of my advisors. But at Washington in ecology, we had to do 3 fields, and it wasn't as interdisciplinary as social plus environmental health sciences, but it was still very interdisciplinary. So, at that point, it wasn't so much that I learned everything I needed to know about endocrinology, because the field has changed incredibly in 20 years, but I learned how to ask questions and how not to be afraid of looking really stupid, because I think a lot of times people are afraid to ask the really basic questions. But now I just figure in seminars and group meetings, if I have a stupid question, probably there's somebody else who wants to know the answer but is afraid of looking stupid. So sometimes my official role is to ask the dumb question. But I'm rarely the only one who's a little confused in these interdisciplinary groups. And then the other answers are, I go to, just to pick up these things, the obvious, I go to review articles. And I go to the National Institute of Medicine or the National Research Council and look at their reports, which are often really helpful because they overview and they try and come up with a state of the science something. So if I need to, say, figure out really quickly what what epigenetics might mean for certain kinds of, the fetal origins of adult disease, I don't jump right into PubMed literature and try and read 10,000 articles. I find review articles and I go to one of the big NRC reports, National Research Council or Institute of Medicine reports.
Okay, and would you say that those are also the most important, just general resources that you have had in your research, going to those reports, or are there other types of resources that have been instrumental to you?
Oh, the biggest resource is always seminars at universities, and now increasingly seminars online. So I was really fortunate at University of Wisconsin. We had a number of interdisciplinary seminars where you could go and hear really extraordinary people in their fields talk, and they knew they were talking to a fairly broad audience, so they spoke in English rather than whatever their particular, insider language was. And so just meeting these people and asking questions was an even better resource than reading the overviews. And increasingly there are more and more really good websites online, the Silent Spring Institute, the Carson Center, there are a whole number of different places where you can find pretty good overviews of some of the questions. So when I started this, epigenetics was still sort of magical to me, but now there's so much different, really good information about these new kinds of are emerging questions and emerging contaminants. So right now I'm trying to learn a lot about climate change because I'm interested in how, I'm not going to become a climatologist, but I'm really interested in how climate change is changing exposure to persistent organic pollutants in fish, in wildlife, in marine mammals, and then the people who eat those. And so I know I'm not going to take up an, atmospheric science 101 textbook, even though maybe I should. But there's lots of places I can go to learn some of the basic questions that I need to know to be able to start reading the scientific literature.
What resources do you wish you had had or tapped into maybe when you were first beginning this type of research?
I wish I had had some travel funds to be able to go, not just to conferences, but to be able to go to different laboratories and working groups and just talk to people about the kinds of work they're doing and see what kinds of questions. So, in medicine, they often, and also in molecular biology, say they often do rotations in different labs and often at different universities. And I think that can be really valuable. One of the things I love about being in Sweden right now is I get to go to lots of different universities. I give a talk and then I spend a couple of days hanging out and learning what other people are working on. And I think it would be great for graduate students and postdocs to have those kind of opportunities as well. They probably need it more than we do.
Is there anything else that you would recommend?
Yes.
Yes,
I just remembered at CHE, at the Center for Culture, Health, and Environment, Culture, History, and Environment that we had at the University of Wisconsin, we got funding from the deans to do a place-based workshop each year. So we would go and spend 4 days all on a bus together, usually staying at a camp at different nights, someplace really cheap. And we would go on a bus full of 30 to 40 people, and it wasn't equally distributed, but it was historians, sociologists, a lot of different people in the scientific fields that were covered, and there was a theme each year. And so, for example, I'm working on mining now because we went on our environmental health field trip. Each year had a different theme. On the environmental health one a couple years ago, we went to the Mole Lake Sokogan, and the Bad River Band came down and talked about their real concerns about potential toxics from the pyritic ore that would lead to, acidification in their watershed. And I had known that there was some discussion of a large open pit iron mine, but we typically think of iron mining as not incredibly toxic. It has other dust issues and, dislocation issues. And that experience was so valuable because it wasn't just hearing from 20 people from the Bad River Band who came down, but also there were nurses on that trip, there were doctors, there were lots of sociologists, there were lots of historians, and having this incredible mixture of people on a bus for 4 days. So I think place-based workshops where you're together with a really broad group of people looking at a particular site with particular challenges is incredibly valuable. I think one of the most challenging skills for people trained in the natural sciences to learn is how to do collaborative research with communities, how to actually, because we're so trained to read the literature, figure out what hasn't been asked, come up with a cool question, find funding for it, and the very thought of giving up a certain amount of control and really working with communities so they define what are the really important questions and you offer your insights and experience and knowledge, but you also have to really learn from their insights and knowledge and experience. And I think that's really critical in working with a lot of environmental justice questions, which overlap a lot, obviously, with social sciences and environmental health. So trying to figure out how to work with affected communities in ways that are really equitable and fair, I think partly means realizing that some of these boundaries we've been trained to set between the subject and the object, that the scientist has to be objective and distant, it kind of breaks apart in environmental health research because we're all affected communities. We're all exposed And that can be really hard, I think, for a lot of students and faculty, a lot of researchers. When you read the 90th study about miscarriage rates and, women pesticide applicators and, read about cancer in beluga whales, it can get pretty overwhelming. And so trying to realize that maintaining that distance is often not going to happen, and yet figuring out a strategy for really listening to the concerns of communities, but also integrating that there are a lot of really troubling questions in environmental health social research, because there are a lot of troubling social patterns and processes in the world. So figuring out how to stay strong and do good work is challenging, but the communities often have a lot to offer with that because they've had to figure this out over centuries. But I think just recognizing that there's a lot of grief involved in doing this work and coming to terms with that. It's like working on slavery or genocide. I don't know how people in genocide studies do it, but they do it. And sometimes a lot of my friends say, I don't know how you can keep working on, synthetic toxic chemicals and stay sane. Yeah, and I actually do believe in many ways where we have a much, much cleaner environment than we did. Partly my current project on Lake Superior, looks at all this whole, mishmash of toxics from mining and pulp and this and that and deforestation. But the big picture is that 100 years ago, there were hardly any trees in the watershed. That place was so trash. The fish were dead. It stunk. It was a pit. Basically, it was a big mining pit and a big deforested pit, and now it's one of the most pristine looking places in North America. The lake trout are back, the wolves are back, the trees are back. It's a different set of ecosystems, but a lot of things have proven pretty resilient, and I think that offers a lot of hope.